It was Valentine's Day, February 14th, a night of love, celebration, and, for some inexplicable disappearance. Every year, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flickered to life, there were whispers of lovers, young and old, who had vanished without a trace on this very day, this very night. Detective Sarah Montgomery had heard the stories. It was her job to investigate the strange, the eerie, and the things people couldn't explain. But this case? It was different. And it had been haunting her for years. The first disappearance she had investigated was in a small town in Vermont. A young couple, Allison and Tom, had planned a quiet night out to celebrate their love, to share dinner, maybe a dance at the local pub. They were seen leaving their house, smiling, full of life, but they never returned. The next morning their car was found by the side of the road, the doors wide open, the engine still running. The only sign that they had ever been there was a single rose, resting gently on the hood of the car. Sarah had been the first one to arrive at the scene. The local authorities were baffled. There were no signs of struggle. No tracks in the snow. No witnesses. Just the empty car, a rose, and the unnerving sense that something had gone horribly wrong. A few days later, another couple, Clara and Jacob, disappeared in a neighboring town. Then another and another. Each time Sarah found the same pattern. Lovers, always couples in the bloom of young love, disappeared without a trace on the night of February 14th. No one seemed to notice, at least not at first. But Sarah? She couldn't shake the feeling that the disappearances were more than just coincidence. They were connected. Now, years later, after many cold cases and countless hours of investigation, Sarah was standing in the very place where it had all started. The old diner at the edge of town, where it was said that Tom and Allison had their last meal. It had been abandoned for years, but tonight she stood at its cracked door, the remnants of the once vibrant neon sign flickering weakly in the cold wind. She had come here before, but tonight the air felt different. It felt charged, as if something was waiting for her, watching her. The air was thick with tension as Sarah stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath her, and the smell of old grease and stale coffee filled the room. The walls, once covered in happy pictures of couples and families, now lay bare, their frames shattered on the floor. The jukebox in the corner was silent, its lights long gone. Yet there was a presence here, an energy that sent chills down her spine. She walked slowly toward the back of the diner, where a small booth had been preserved in dusty solitude. It was here, in this very booth, where Tom and Allison had sat, laughing and planning their future. It was here that they had made their final toast, a promise of forever. It was here that the mysteries began. Sarah sat down, the worn leather creaking beneath her. She looked out the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she gazed out at the quiet, snow-covered streets. Everything was still. Everything was waiting. And then she heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of paper in the wind. It was so soft at first, Sarah wasn't sure if she was imagining it. But it grew louder. Clear. She turned her head sharply, her eyes scanning the empty room. Sarah? The voice was unmistakable. It was low and ethereal, like a distant echo calling her name. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, unable to move. Was it the wind? No. The voice was too clear. Too familiar. Sarah, you've come? The voice was coming from the corner of the diner, from the shadows where the jukebox used to stand. She stood up, her breath quickening, and walked toward the voice. With each step, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, thicker. The temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the cold air. She wasn't alone. She turned the corner, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, her long hair hanging loosely around her shoulders. She wore an old-fashioned dress, one that looked like it belonged to a different time. But what caught Sarah's attention was the faint glow around her, an almost ethereal light that seemed to pulse with life. The woman's eyes were wide, locked onto Sarah's with a mixture of sorrow and something else. Something far darker. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile filled with grief, with pain. "I am one of them," she said softly, her voice like a broken melody. "I am one of the lovers who vanished. We're trapped, Sarah. Trapped in this night?" Sarah's pulse raced. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But she was standing in front of the woman, this apparition, who was speaking in riddles, speaking of a truth she couldn't yet understand. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "The night," the woman continued, her voice growing quieter, more distant. "Valentine's Day. The night when we are taken. We are meant to vanish, Sarah. The love, the promise, it all leads to this. We are taken by the shadows. Sarah stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows? The woman nodded. The shadows are the ones who choose. They feed off love, off the bond between two hearts. And once you are chosen, there is no escape. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and the diner seemed to stretch and distort. The walls closed in, and Sarah could hear a faint whispering, voices speaking in unison, in a language she didn't understand. The woman stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. It's happening again, Sarah. The shadows are coming for you. They've come for all of us. The woman's form flickered like a fading light, before dissipating into the air, leaving only the faint smell of roses behind. The whispers faded, and the oppressive feeling that had filled the diner lifted, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sarah was alone again. But now she understood. The disappearances weren't just random events. They were part of something much larger, something far older. The shadows fed on love, on the bond between two people, and on every Valentine's Day they came, claiming lovers who were too innocent, too hopeful to resist. She had to stop them. But how? The answer, it seemed, was locked in the shadows. And Sarah knew deep down that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. The woman had been right. The shadows were coming. The city had never felt more alive, yet in the deepest part of Sarah Montgomery's mind, it had never felt more suffocating. As she stood in the empty diner, the echoes of the woman's words hung heavy in the air, clinging to her like the stale scent of old roses. The shadows were real. They weren't just stories. And they were coming for her. Coming for everyone who had ever loved. The once familiar world outside the diner felt foreign now. The fog was thicker than ever, curling around the streetlights and seeping into every crack and crevice, drowning the city in its suffocating grip. The Valentine's Day celebration that had filled the streets just hours ago had shifted into something darker. People moved through the fog, but their faces were hollow, their smiles absent, as if they were all under some silent, unseen spell. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. But how? What could she do against something that existed in the shadows, something that thrived on love and left nothing but empty space in its wake? She couldn't shake the image of the woman, the lover, trapped in time, lost in the endless loop of that night. But she was not the first to be taken. Victor and Clara. Tom and Allison. The others. They had all been claimed, all vanished into the nothingness that waited in the shadows. And now it seemed it was her turn. With a sense of dread in her chest, Sarah walked back to her car. She needed answers. She needed to find out who else had vanished before, and more importantly, why the shadows had chosen them. Why now? She drove through the streets, her eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement that seemed out of place. The streets were emptier now, the fog lingering like a bad memory. Her mind raced as she thought back to all the disappearances that had occurred on this night, all the families who had lost their loved ones to a force they couldn't see, couldn't understand. Sarah pulled into the local cemetery, the place where the first of the mysterious disappearances had begun. It had always felt like a dead end, a place where the past had been buried, forgotten. But tonight, it was the only place she could go. The cold, forgotten graves held the secrets she needed to unlock. The cemetery was as silent as the rest of the city, the air so still it almost felt unnatural. She walked through the rows of headstones, the names etched into the stone barely visible in the dim light. But then she stopped. There, in front of her, was a grave she hadn't noticed before. It was newer than the others. The stone was smooth, unmarred by time, with a single name carved into it, Amelia Thompson. The year of her birth was not on the stone, only the year of her death, 1895. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Amelia Thompson. She'd never heard of her before, but there was something about the name that made her stomach twist. Amelia Thompson had vanished on Valentine's Day, 1895, the first recorded disappearance in the town's history. Sarah knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the stone. She could feel the cold seep into her bones as the air grew colder still. The shadows around the cemetery seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if they were alive, responding to her presence. She stood up and turned toward the gates of the cemetery. She knew there had to be something more. Amelia's disappearance had to be the key, the starting point of everything that had happened. She had to dig deeper. As Sarah headed toward the town library, she noticed a man standing in the shadows, just beyond the streetlight's reach. His silhouette was tall, thin, his features obscured by the fog. He was watching her, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, Sarah considered walking away, but some force she couldn't explain, drove her forward. As she approached, the man stepped out of the shadows, his face coming into view. He was old, with a long flowing coat that seemed to ripple with the fog. His eyes were pale, almost translucent, and his voice, when he spoke, was like a breath of wind, soft but full of power. "You're looking for answers, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a whisper in the stillness. Sarah nodded slowly, her hand instinctively gripping the strap of her bag. She didn't know who this man was, but there was something about him that felt ancient, like he had been here longer than she had. "I know what you're after," the man continued. "But be careful, detective. The shadows are not kind to those who seek them out. They will offer you the truth, but they will take something from you in return." Sarah stood her ground, her curiosity now piqued more than ever. "What do you mean? What are the shadows?" The man smiled, a strange, knowing smile. "You've heard their whispers, haven't you? Seen them, perhaps? The shadows that follow lovers. The ones that come on this night to take what is theirs. Why? Why do they do this?" Sarah's voice cracked, her fear now bubbling to the surface. She had come this far, but now she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answers. Not when they felt so close. Not when the shadows were starting to creep toward her. "They feed on love," the man replied, his voice growing colder. "They are born from the bond between two hearts. They grow stronger with each union, each promise. And once they are full, they take those who are most vulnerable." "Why Amelia Thompson?" Sarah asked, her thoughts racing. Why was she the first? The man's eyes seemed to cloud over for a moment, as though he were looking at something far away. Amelia was the first but not the last. She was the one who started it all, the first to be claimed. She fell in love with someone she should never have loved. And she paid the price. The shadows around them seemed to shift, the fog growing thicker, darker. The man's form began to fade, becoming one with the mist. "Be careful, detective," he said, his voice now a mere whisper. "The shadows are watching you. And when they come for you, there will be no escape." With that, the man disappeared, swallowed by the fog, leaving Sarah alone in the cold, empty street. She stood there, frozen, her mind spinning. What had she just learned? The shadows had been watching Amelia. They had been watching the others. And now they were watching her. The truth was worse than she could have imagined. The shadows weren't just a curse. They were a force, ancient and powerful, fed by the love of the innocent, and they had chosen Sarah to be their next victim. She had to stop them. But how? How could she fight something so old, so powerful? As Sarah stood alone in the mist, a feeling of dread settled over her. The shadows were closing in, and this time there would be no escape.